Hey guys, my name's Nick. I'm a Microsoft Certified Expert Administrator. Create a lot of content for MSPs. Today's video is part 3 of a little mini series I created here for Azure Information Protection. If you haven't already, do check out my intro video and my video on Discover and Classify. Today we're going to be going over the Protect section here, which includes the policy creation for both labels and the policies to publish the labels into our organizations. So when we look at the actual policies that we've created here, we've agreed on the taxonomy with our customers here on what that actually looks like. This is when we can then come in and apply certain controls for these documents for heightened protection or getting more granular in the sense of not allowing people to print these documents or anything like that. So I'm going to be walking through all of that. I'm here in the Security and Compliance Center. This is going to be the new portal of which you're going to manage these from an admin standpoint. Previously, if you've used labels in the past, you're familiar with Azure Information Protection being in Azure. I'm actually going to stay within this portal though, just because it's going to be a future consideration of what we'll need to be working out of. So I'd like to keep it here for now. Whenever you define, your labels here, you can define the taxonomy without finishing up the actual controls that will be in place here. But when I click on one of these labels, I can click on edit. And ideally we would already have a description defined based off of what I've agreed upon with the particular customer. For encryption, now we have the ability to apply encryption at rest or in transit. And so whenever you're thinking about this and applying this to documents, I recommend if you've highlighted a taxonomy with confidential or highly confidential, you are applying that encryption to that particular email or message or document, I would say in this case. But outside of that, I would say for assign permissions now or let users decide. For this one, you can assign permissions now, and this is where you're assigning those permissions down below, where you're saying that this users and groups have these permissions applied to them. In this case, it's co-author, which, as you can see here, gives you the full list. But if you go to add different groups or authenticated users here, you can choose the permissions of which you're giving them. So you can see here, co-author gives them all these rights. And this is something where you could create a custom role, custom permissions as well too, and maybe prevent them from printing a document or maybe prevent them from copying any of that content and extracting it there. So it's preventing them from using the clipboard. With co-author again though, you don't have these abilities to change because it's a pre-made template. But this is something that I recommend, again, because of the fact that users will get confused by this or have to ask you a lot of questions. You keep this at assign permissions now. But if you're working with a more mature organization who understands the technology really well and wants to apply permissions when they apply a label, then they can do so. Or maybe you want to isolate that to a few users. But to me, that just gets really hairy and could open up a lot of help desk calls to you as the MSP. User access to content expires. You can choose to make content expire after certain labels applied. This is a good one for certain price sheets or something like that that are limited for a certain piece of time, and maybe you don't want users accessing stale data that doesn't exist anymore. So you may want to apply this label here, which is actually really powerful for people to not be using old information. So that's really the best use case for that. But you could also say, when they're sharing this content outside to somebody else, if this label's applied, then their access to the content expires after 7 days, instead of them having to do that when they share the document themselves, which people always remember. Allow offline access. You could choose only for a number of days, never always. And this is good in the remote workforce as well too. If they are working off of a personal computer, or if you're giving access to a guest, you're allowing them only for a certain number of days to get offline access. But in the case of complexity, that can get a little hairy as well too from what you're looking at. So it has to be a good use case for you to be able to do that. And we talked about permissions here. For the content marking, you can apply watermarks, you can apply headers, footers, You can apply, like I did here, confidential as a watermark across the document, and you can customize the text for the font size, color, layout, everything like that. So it can be as custom as you want. Diagonal is usually really good just to apply. The auto labeling for Office 365 apps is only as part of the 365 or Azure Information Protection Plan 2, where you get that. Not a lot of people have that, but this allows you to describe certain conditions or keywords or sensitive information like credit cards, for instance, to apply a default label if it detects it. Like say you have credit card information, you want to say that's a confidential doc, it'll automatically do that without the actual user interacting with it. So it's a powerful experience. It's $5 a user a month to get that feature, but it is part of these other plans as well. But not a lot of MSPs in the SMB market have that plan that I know of. So I don't think it's very common to be able to use this, unless it's certainly pertinent, especially for firms that are under compliance regulations, things like that, to be able to use. So after you've done all that, you can apply all this and apply these protections to the actual document itself. If you apply this to a document and that user sends the document, it's not going to block them from sending to an outside domain. But when that outside domain user gets that email, they'll open that up and they'll have to use their authentication to log in to Word or whatever you're sending part of the Office suite. And when they do so, if it's not your domain that they're logging in with, they will get blocked and it'll tell them they don't have rights to see this document. So this is where a combination of DLP plus these labels comes in handy, because if it does detect sensitive content in the email or in the document, like a credit card, it just prevents them from sending it all together. Otherwise, just with labels, you're going to get this back and forth of, hey, it told me I couldn't open up this document, and then you may realize, oh yeah, that's right, it's a confidential doc, it's labeled with that, I cannot allow you to open that either. So those are good things to note. Label policies, though, like I mentioned before, this is something where you can configure this all day, but until you publish a policy with the labels included, nobody's going to be able to see this or use this. So whenever you have a policy, you'll create a new one here, and I've already created one, but it does allow you to choose the sensitivity labels that you're going to apply as part of this policy and scope to certain users to be able to see. So with this one, there may be users in which you only want to see the sublabels, like maybe HR has some sublabels under confidential that you want to scope as part of another policy, but the whole org themselves has this list as the top level taxonomy that you've decided on. But there may be some more granular groups or groups that have more granular labels that are sublabels to these. That's what I recommend as far as the creation here. When you publish, though, this is where you choose the scope of users. Obviously, we would ideally like to apply it to all users and not have sublabels or have to worry about that, but there's obviously a lot of complexity in certain customer environments. With the policy settings here, you can choose to have a default label applied to documents, just no matter what, for all these users. So maybe it's just by default it's always public, or maybe it's always internal and they have to choose a lower level label to mark it as public. I don't recommend doing that personally, unless you've defined its taxonomy that is a little bit easier than what this is today. This doesn't make sense to define one out of the gate. Users will provide justification to remove a label or lower classification. I really like this one just because it gives you an audit trail of if they moved it from like a confidential status into personal or public, and they're providing justification for doing so that you have complete audit trail of when that happened, who did it, and why they did that in the organization. And then if you follow along with Discover, and you'll see this in monitoring, you can see the activity logs here, and you can see when somebody downgraded a label or something like that. And this is a clear example of that I can give, where somebody did that and they had the full metadata of what that looks like here for you to be able to see. And then requires users to apply a label to their email or documents. I don't recommend applying this one out of the gate. It's really disruptive to the end users. It requires them, if they're saving a document or if they're sending an email, to apply a label to it. And just out of the gate, email alone, no way. That causes way too much disruption. Documents alone are one thing, but email is something I wouldn't say that you would require. provide users with a link to a custom help page. This is really cool. If you guys link in a page that describes the taxonomy a little bit more and some use cases for the client, so they can just see that and reference that in case they need additional help beyond the description that you're providing as part of the labels. And you can name your policy, and you can review and save and publish that. And when it's done, you'll have that available within the instance here for the particular user. And then you'll be able to start applying these labels. They will be starting to be able to apply these labels and get that protection whatever you've scoped out there. So it's very straightforward in a lot of cases. Again, try to make it as simplistic as you can with creating the most security. So that taxonomy, whether it just be you've created 3 labels and one of them's confidential or secret, or maybe you've created the 4 with confidential, highly confidential, definitely encrypt those and make sure that they are scoped to the appropriate users who should have access controls to those as well too. That's everything I wanted to show for you guys in this video. Stay tuned for the monitor video that'll come out here next. Otherwise, please like or subscribe to the channel if you guys want to see more video content around Microsoft 365 and the MSP space. Thanks guys, have a great day.